Okay, great. So we're very pleased to have with us today Ryder, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, and Salous Klaus Chilima, the Vice President of Malawi, who are here to discuss the launch of the ILO's report on the least developed countries. Mr. Vice President, I assume you're going to speak first, and then the ILO Director General. Yes, please proceed.
Right. Thank you very much. First of all, let me say that we have witnessed the launch of the International Labour Organization's report under the theme Human-Centered Recovery and Future of Work in LDCs. I come here wearing two hats, one representing the President of Malawi, His Excellency Dr. Lazarus McCarthy Chakwera, as Chair of LDCs, and of course as President of the Republic of Malawi. A few points to just quickly highlight, probably five, in as far as the report itself is concerned. Number one is the fact that it will serve as an important background document for the 5th UN conference in Doha, in Qatar, next year in March. Second is the fact that it also notes the fact that the pandemic has caused a lot of setbacks in LDCs, particularly in the fight against poverty, competitiveness, access to public health, as well as quality of education. Probably the third point to make is that the report itself reveals that LDCs have been unable to realize their full potential. And it goes on to talk about the unemployment numbers there. Fourth, which will be now under the corrective measures, the report will say what it says about the diagnostics, but perhaps what is more useful is the corrective interventions. So first is the fact that the LDCs need to harness the digital economy if they are to be competitive on the global platform. Second is on skilling to leverage the call in the Doha Program of Action for training, promoting active labor market policies, as well as transitioning from school to work. And the last point I will make is around the fact that there is a sizable youth population which we must take as a very big asset in the LDCs. The world today belongs to the youth, and the youth therefore must be capacitated and enabled to do what they must do. To close by saying that, and this is a message that has been repeated throughout the week, urgency is key. We don't have the luxury of time, and we must act, and the time is now. So I'll stop there and probably pass on to the Director General.
Mr. Ryder, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everybody. The Vice President has said some of the most important things. Let me just say a few words about what you might find in this rather extensive report that we're launching today, which is, as the Vice President has indicated, consciously a contribution to the 5th Conference of Least Developed Countries coming up in Doha next year. What this report tries to do is to x-ray, as it were, what the world of work looks like in LDCs. And we find some very important characteristics. I'll just mention a few which seem to me to be of the greatest importance. These are economies, firstly, where the vast majority of people work in conditions of informality. 89% is the aggregate figure of people working in LDCs work informally. The global figure is 61%. Any policy interventions have to take cognizance of this reality of all-pervasive informality. Secondly, and it goes hand in hand with what I've just said, there is high duality in these economies. What do I mean by that? It means that there are, for example, in terms of enterprises, a relatively few, a small number of very large formal enterprises, many of them in the business of export, commodity or extractive industry exports, but the vast majority of enterprises are micro or small enterprises acting informally, very often in the agricultural sector, which still employs the majority of working people. There is a missing middle in the enterprises of LDCs. There are these few large formal companies and a very large number of micro enterprises. Enterprise development needs to fill the gap. Third point is the dramatically low levels of social protection available in LDCs. Our figures show that only 14, that's 14% of the population of LDCs have access to any one social benefit. And by comparison, again, the corresponding figure for other developing countries is 45%. For developed countries, we're at 85%. There is a massive social protection deficit. This has been laid bare in the most dramatic and sometimes brutal way by the COVID pandemic. We, and when I say we, I mean the LDCs themselves, but also the international community, have to ensure the type of investment in LDC social protection that brings the minimum coverage needed. I'll give you one number. I'm not going to overload you with number. Providing what we call social protection floor coverage to the entirety of LDC populations would require an annual investment of 122.7 billion, that's with a B, US dollars for all LDCs. 122.7 billion, and that is just over 11% of the combined GDP of LDCs. So that gives you, I think, a clear understanding of the international responsibilities in this regard, and that links very closely with the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection, which the Secretary General launched last September. If I want to, and this is my closing word, summarize the challenge before us, it is the challenge of structural transformation for LDCs, an idea that's been around for a very long time in development thinking, but it gives you the idea that this is not simply about applying technology or inserting LDCs better into global supply systems or educating and skilling the workforce or much else. It's about doing all of these things in a single transformative endeavor. That's what the ambitions in Doha and of the Doha Programme of Action are, and it are also the aims to which this report seeks to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll now open the floor to questions. Edie Lederer.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. The Vice President of Malawi talked about the impact of the pandemic on LDCs. I wonder if you could both add and tell us the impact of the war in Ukraine on LDCs. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I'll go first. The impact of the pandemic is what we have seen. I think over the last 36 months, it has impacted economies in different ways. The good news, there are plans across, and I think it's across the globe. Economies are looking at ways how to recover, and Malawi is no exception. And we do have our own recovery plan, which is quite comprehensive. Diagnostic in terms of which sectors were grossly affected, and then what interventions you put in place. I think what remains now is to finance that plan. and probably the same applies to a number of LDCs. And I wanted to make the point before I switch on to the conflict in Ukraine that this report that International Labour Organization has launched today is really building on from lessons from the pandemic. And I like the fact that it is human-centric. because we had a lot of labor issues during the time of the pandemic. People had to stay home and stuff. I mean, others lost their jobs, and as we put people at the center of the recovery as we go forward, and as a foundation for next year, surely this is a good direction that we're taking. Now, coming to the point and the specific you ask about the conflict. First is to say that the conflict is there. We can't say that it isn't, and we continue to join others, first as Malawi, that there must be dialogue and quick resolution. We need peace. That point must be made and possibly amplified. Second is to say that as LDCs and probably as the Africa region, different economies, because each jurisdiction has got its own unique economic issues, surely they will be impacted. I can speak for this, southern African region that probably fuel becomes number one. So if you want to call it energy as a way of calling it, that's fine. But fuel prices have gone up, so that's one thing that we can already feel with it, because fertilizer is also key in Africa. Most of the economies are agrarian. Ours is certainly quite dependent on agriculture, so the impact will be felt as we go into the growing season later in the year, so probably October, November. There may not be, if I speak for Malawi itself, probably issues like wheat may not be a big thing. It will be a big thing in other economies in Africa. Now, that's the negative side of these things, but what do we then do? Do we sit and cry and feel sorry for ourselves? I think not. There is opportunity to then actually to borrow from the attitude of the people of Ukraine themselves. In the midst of all this conflict, I think they've come out very positive, and it's something that personally I think is a good learning point. And economies needed to say, what do we then do as we go forward? We can look at what would be, in the case of Malawi, what would be a replacement of the fertilizer? Can we do composite? There will be a deficit in the wheat production on the global market. Can we go into a deliberate wheat production campaign on the local front? That will address our ability to earn forex as we export, which is also one big thing. And I think there were spring meetings last week in DC. It sets us as one of the countries that whose debt is unsustainable, and one of the reasons is the fact that our current account is grossly impacted by the imbalance between import and export. So I think that the conflict is there. It has brought about its own challenges. The attitude we should adopt is to say, what next? How do we then make the economies tick for the people? I mean, it's not going to be good for us to be sitting and feeling sorry for ourselves. And other markets have already, or other economies have already started responding. And I think we should all do that as LDCs and, of course, as Malawi. Let me stop there.
Okay, thanks. Oh, yes.
I'll be very quick because I think the Vice President's given you the substance. I mean, there are clearly, and I think the Secretary General's been absolutely right in this, 3 transmission mechanisms through which the ripples of the crisis in Ukraine are being felt around the world. And as the Vice President has said, it's food, it is energy, and we know what's happening in the markets. And the third, as he's alluded to, is debt and finance. And I think what is particularly alarming, and we saw it from the spring meetings of the bank and the fund, is the extent to which developing countries are falling into circumstances of debt distress. And if this is not addressed, and frankly I don't see it being addressed sufficiently well up to this point, we run the risk of running into a financial crisis, which is going to make the type of reactive policies which the Vice President has mentioned all the more difficult to effect. So again, we have to act on all of these 3 contextual issues. And the last point is, please don't think that COVID-19 has gone. I'm not talking epidemiologically, but the global labour markets are now operating considerably below levels of employment that existing pre-pandemic. We have not got back to where we started or anything near it. And the differential here, of course, is that whilst the developed countries, at least until Ukraine hit us, have bounced back rather strongly, the developing and emerging economies have not, and this is the great divergence which the Secretary General has referred to and makes issues of inequity and inequality particularly acute at this dangerous time.
Thanks very much. Are there... Yes?
I'll do a follow-up then, James Bayes, Al Jazeera, on that very point. I mean, how long will it take to get back to even the starting point, and how much will this, disruption from the war in Ukraine prevent you from doing that? I mean, is it a perfect storm that these two things have, this is now following COVID-19?
Perfect storm or not, I don't know, but it's very heavy turbulence. Pre-Ukraine, we were projecting unemployment globally to go back down to pre-pandemic levels in 23, not before 23. And by the way, that's an aggregate figure, which does not, if you disaggregate it, you again see the developed world doing better than the developing world. That's pre-Ukraine. Now, you've all seen the first quarter figures of GDP in the United States this week. I think that the impact of Ukraine is unfolding before our eyes, but it's rather early to say where it's going to take us. We're in the process at the ILO of doing some simulations based on what happens in the conflict of Ukraine, a move towards hopefully a peace settlement relatively quickly or an extended conflict. And of course, I am not in any position to predict which of those two scenarios or some variant upon them is going to appear. But the consequences for the global economy are vastly different depending on what happens. And I think this is what distinguishes the Ukrainian conflict from other conflicts. It is having these global economic impacts, which are extremely serious. Yes.
Right. Thank you very much once again. I think that we need to remember that there is a pre-pandemic context. And what does the picture look like for the LDCs? And I think the studies say what they say. I think what the pandemic, and we need to introduce the third, which is the climate change conversation, which is already there. What they have already done to these economies is to really just, exacerbate the situation. And the conflict in Ukraine is already adding swords to injury. Now, first of all, to agree, I think the conflict now is in its probably 6th week or 7th week, and I think we will still be running simulations to see the full impact as we go, as it evolves. One hopes that it doesn't have to go that far. We need peace, like we have said. But whether it is going to go on for another weekday or for another week or for another month or whatever it is, we have COVID. Yes, it's not ending just yet. The situation is looking much better than it did 12 months ago. Some airlines are back in the air. Service industry is beginning to warm up again. And these are all good indicators. Like I said, the good news is the economies, a good number of them, I think, we can speak for Malawi, we do have a plan on how we should recover. What hasn't helped is obviously, before we even talk about the conflict in Ukraine, we talk about climate change. We have been hit by 2 storms. That knocks out, in Malawi, 100 megawatts plus of electricity. That's a big problem because it impacts industry immediately. And then as you go further, you'll be saying, what does the economy look like in the LDCs, given the statistics that are there? And the Director General here has said it. What does the situation look like in the next 12 months, 24 months? It probably is going to be a cocktail, depending on which economies you're looking at and on what those economies are actually grounded. I think, picking on from the conversation over the last 4 days here at ECOSOC, one of the advocacies, and I know that there is different schools of thought, and that's good, there must be, the advocacy from the LDCs around the whole debt piece is beyond just suspension, to advocate for a cancellation. And I think that this is a contagious, I beg your pardon, not a contagious, a contentious issue, because there will be, like I said, different thoughts around it. But that be as it may, if we say suspension, what are we suspending it? Who are we suspending it for, and for what period? How do we know that there won't be another cyclone in the next 12 months? How do we know that there won't be another pandemic? How do we know that there won't be another exogenous shock that will, destabilize these economies? And therefore, for us, we need to say what mitigants do we put in place in order that when the debt is cancelled or forgiven, we then put enough safeguards that these economies will not recede again as we go. And that's the advocacy we live here. And we made the point on behalf of the LDCs as well as the Africa Group that we will need to rethink this whole conversation around debt because we really do not see how, given these, even set aside the conflict in Ukraine, COVID impact on its own, and then, of course, the whole issue around climate change is bad enough or has been bad enough to destabilize and put the economies off track. So we will need to, look at this whole thing holistically. Pre-pandemic context, now that this thing is looking like the signs are looking good, it hasn't ended yet, but we hope that, as we go with vaccines and so on and so forth, the situation is looking a lot better. What do we project it to look like in the next 12 months or so? And then we take more impactful decisions around the whole debt management conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Those of you who are online, if you want, you can open your mics and ask a question at this point. If not, I'd like to thank both our guests, the Vice President of Malawi and the Director General of the ILO. Thank you very much for your time and for your briefing. And for those of you in the press, please stay in the room. The spokesperson for the President of the General Assembly, Paulina Kubiak, will brief you next.